He splashed boiling water on the child, and she was called a thief in front of everyone. But they didn't know who she was. The calm mother took out her badge, and the officers turned pale. Look how one woman changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. It was the kind of Sunday morning that whispered, not shouted. A pale sun stretched its fingers over the rooftops of Langston, Alabama, warming the red bricks of sleepy storefronts and the dewy grass along the sidewalks. The streets were almost empty, save for a few early risers and the occasional pickup truck humming along. At the edge of town, just off the old highway, stood Dixie Jack's, an old 24-hour diner with squeaky booths, sticky menus, and a sign that buzzed even when the lights weren't on. Inside, the air smelled of maple syrup, frying bacon, and burnt coffee. The usual patrons were scattered across their familiar places, a retired couple reading the Sunday paper without speaking, a trucker nursing a third refill at the counter, a teenage waitress wiping down the pie case with slow, circular strokes. Lin Meifeng entered quietly, holding the hands of her two daughters Xiaoting, age 5, her small steps bouncing with curiosity, and Xiaoyu, age 7, calm and observant, clutching a small notebook against her chest. They had been here once before, weeks ago, and the girls remembered the window booth with the sunlight that warmed the seats. That's where they went. Meifeng guided them with the ease of routine, but her eyes, dark, alert, calculating, swept across the room with a soldier's awareness. She wore a soft gray sweater, jeans, and simple sneakers. Nothing about her drew attention, and that was the way she liked it. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, face bare of makeup, expression quiet and unreadable. The girls slid into the booth, giggling over some private joke. Xiaoting pointed at a drawing she'd made of a bunny in sunglasses, and Xiaoyu, slightly more serious, began flipping through her notebook. Meifeng sat across from them, smiling faintly, eyes never fully relaxed. A waitress approached. Orders were placed. Pancakes, orange juice, an omelet with mushrooms. Meifeng asked for black coffee. Then she leaned back, watching the sunlight paint golden patches on the table, allowing for a moment the illusion of peace to settle. But in Langston, peace was always temporary. Nearly an hour passed. The food came, half-eaten and pushed around, little syrup pools forming on the plate. The girls played with their utensils, now full, now fidgeting. Meifeng had just taken her second sip of lukewarm coffee when the door jingled again. 2 officers entered, uniformed, loud. One taller, broad in the shoulders with a military buzz cut and stiff jaw, Officer Clay Maddox. The other, leaner, with a lopsided smirk and sunglasses still perched on his head, Officer Trent Malloy. They spoke briefly with the man behind the counter, laughed at something, then turned toward the dining area. Meifeng clocked them the moment they stepped in. Her spine straightened, breath slowed, hands instinctively rested near her purse. Her daughters didn't notice. Xiaoting was busy making her teddy bear drink maple syrup from a straw. Xiaoyu doodled a small badge in her notebook. The officers lingered near the counter for a minute, glancing around. Maddox's eyes landed on Meifeng's table. Something in his expression shifted. Malloy followed his gaze and nudged him. They exchanged a wordless agreement. They approached the booth. The diner's hum dulled. Forks paused midair. A low tension rippled through the room, invisible yet palpable. Maddox stood over the table, holding a steaming mug of coffee. The muscles in his jaw twitched. He looked directly at Meifeng, then glanced pointedly at the girls, at the uneaten pancakes, at the check that hadn't yet arrived. No one else had been asked to show identification. No one else had a uniformed man looming over them during breakfast. Meifeng's gaze rose slowly, evenly. She did not flinch. Her voice when it came was quiet. She asked if there was a problem. Maddox responded louder than necessary. Words that cut through the clatter of plates. Accusations of loitering, of skipping the bill. Malloy stood just behind him, smirking with the air of a man who'd watched this scene play out before and never tired of it. The room fell into that peculiar silence where everything is too loud. The shuffling of shoes, the squeak of vinyl booths, the gurgle of the coffee machine behind the counter, all now seemed magnified, as if the air itself braced for what would come next. Meifeng responded with poise. explaining that they hadn't received the check yet. Her tone was steady, her hands unmoving. Her daughters had stopped their play. Zhao Ting hugged her teddy bear tightly. Zhao Yu reached for her mother's sleeve, uncertain. Maddox leaned closer. His tone grew sharper. Malloy, emboldened, added a cruel comment about people like them, always playing victim. He let the words hang, venomous and loud. Then Maddox gestured with the coffee mug, and in that careless motion, a shift of the wrist, a poorly veiled threat, a stream of hot liquid spilled over the edge. It splashed onto Xiao Ting's hoodie. The little girl screamed, not from pain so much as shock. Mei Fang moved instantly, wrapping both daughters in her arms, pulling them close, inspecting her youngest shoulder. The smell of burned cotton filled the air. The entire diner gasped. Chairs scraped against the floor as people half rose, then hesitated. Behind the officers, Malloy stopped smirking. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. Someone near the counter stood, then quickly sat down when Maddox shot him a glare. Xiao Yu began to cry, and Mei Fang stood. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Her body straightened, her arms relaxed at her sides. She reached for her purse with the precision of someone who had trained for moments just like this, under pressure, under scrutiny, under threat. The officers tensed. Their hands moved subtly toward their belts, their postures rigid, preparing for escalation. But Mei Fang did not raise her voice. She did not flinch, and she did not rush. From her bag, she pulled a small black wallet. She flipped it open. The gold badge inside caught the light from the window. It gleamed, crisp and unmistakable. The room held its breath. The name on the ID read Lin Mei Fang, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that followed was not passive. It was electric. Tables that had been witnesses now became juries. Faces turned. Phones came out. Fingers hovered over record buttons. And Mei Fang, standing between her trembling daughters and two uniformed men who thought they saw an easy mark, looked not angry, not proud, but steady like someone who had seen far worse and was ready to see it through again. The quiet before had ended. Now it was time to speak. The diner stood in the suspended animation. Even the hum of the overhead fluorescent light seemed to hush. The badge in Lin Mei Fang's hand glinted beneath the yellowish lamps, its surface unmarred, pristine. The words around its seal, Federal Bureau of Investigation, were carved in authority, not for spectacle, but for precision. It was not raised in triumph or for intimidation. It simply was, like gravity, like truth, the kind of truth that silenced noise. The coffee still dripped slowly from the edge of the table, a dark puddle growing beneath Xiao Ting's dangling shoe. Her little fingers clung to her mother's pant leg, her face streaked with the remnants of tears, cheeks still flushed with fear. Zhao Yu held on to her sister now, looking at the badge, then at the two officers who had moments ago loomed as figures of control. Their figures now seemed shriveled, diminished by the weight of their own miscalculation. Mei Fang did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The badge did not need explaining, and neither did her presence. When she spoke, her voice was level and stripped of emotion, the tone of a professional reciting protocol, a veteran not interested in drama, only justice. She began to state the violations. First, the unlawful intimidation of a citizen without cause. Then the use of implied and actual force against a minor, the tone-deaf remarks laced with racial bias. Finally, the assault carried out under color of law, a phrase that seemed to puncture the air like a needle, causing Maddox to stiffen and glance around the room as though realizing too late he was not in control anymore. Her hand moved to the phone in her other palm. She pressed a button. A red light blinked. Recording. She said she wanted immediate surrender of both officers' body camera footage. She requested they make no further contact with her, her children, or any civilian present until internal affairs had been notified. Maddox opened his mouth, but whatever he was about to say dried up before it reached sound. His eyes darted toward his partner. Malloy tried to shrug it off with a crooked smile, a failed attempt to spin it into a misunderstanding, but even that crumbled when he realized the growing ring of witnesses surrounding them. They weren't silent anymore. A man near the kitchen pulled out his own phone. A waitress in the corner stared with wide, ashamed eyes. Someone muttered, "She's FBI?" And the words rippled like dropped stones across the floor. Then, a movement at the back. An older man rose from a booth near the back wall, tall and commanding in a quiet, unassuming way. He was dressed in plain clothes, dark blazer, navy shirt, weathered boots. Nothing ostentatious. But when he stepped forward and lifted a wallet of his own, the glint of a badge caught the light once again. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying without effort. Miguel Hernandez, Deputy Director of the FBI's Southeastern Division. He'd been traveling through town on personal business, had stopped in for breakfast, and witnessed the entire encounter. He nodded at Mei Fong, then turned his attention to the officers. The shift in energy was immediate. If Mei Fong's badge had been thunder, Hernandez's was lightning. Malloy stepped back. Maddox let go of his belt. His coffee mug, the one that had been held with such careless power, slipped from his grasp and shattered on the linoleum. The sound rang out across the diner like punctuation. This time, no one told anyone to sit down. The entire diner was already standing. Phones recorded. A few people whispered apologies, some to Mei Fang, some to the children, some to the very air that had become complicit by silence. An older woman at the far table wiped her eyes and said something to her husband, who nodded and lowered his head. The owner of the diner, a round man in his 60s, emerged from the kitchen looking pale, his apron stained, his mouth opening and closing without sound. A small crowd began to form around the booth. Mei Fang remained standing, calm, unshaken. Her daughter stayed close. She knelt briefly beside Xiao Ting to check the soaked hoodie, gently brushing wet hair from her daughter's forehead. The child wasn't burned. The liquid had cooled enough before it hit, but the moment had carved itself in memory nonetheless. The paramedics arrived 10 minutes later. Someone had called them. Perhaps the diner owner, perhaps the elderly woman. No one could say for sure. But when the two EMTs came through the door, they did not rush to the officers. They approached Mei Fong with solemnity and focus, asking if the child needed care, if anyone was hurt. One of them knelt to examine Xiao Ting, speaking gently, asking permission before touching her. Mei Fang watched her daughters closely, still shielding them with her presence. She remained in command, but it was no longer the kind of command taught at the academy. This was maternal, unshakable, rooted in generations of women who knew what it meant to stand between innocence and harm. Hernandez remained nearby, speaking on a radio with regional command. His words were clear and deliberate. 2 officers were to be relieved of duty pending federal investigation. He wanted their supervisor on the line by end of day. Body camera footage was to be retrieved, diner surveillance secured, all witness statements collected. The weight of every syllable struck the tiled floor like gravel underfoot. Maddox tried weakly to protest, that they didn't know, that she hadn't said who she was, that there was confusion. Hernandez turned to him with the steady force of a man who had long since lost patience with such excuses. That was the problem. You didn't know. You didn't ask. You assumed. And you acted. Those words did not come from Mei Fong. They came from the deputy director, and they landed with a kind of finality that closed every mouth in the building. No more was said to the officers. Their radios were removed, their badges taken, their weapons collected without incident. The process was slow, methodical, humiliating. Not because it was loud, but because it was silent. Everyone watched. Everyone knew what they were seeing, a reckoning that had waited too long. The girls were seated again, wrapped in clean blankets brought by the paramedics. The panda toy, now stained, was placed carefully in a small evidence bag. One of the medics gave Xiao Ting a lollipop. She held it without tasting it. Mei Fang didn't thank the apologies offered to her, but she didn't reject them either. She nodded, accepting them not as comfort, but as acknowledgments, as bricks in the wall of accountability that was finally, slowly, being built. The owner of the diner tried to explain that he hadn't seen everything, that he'd been in the back, that he'd never meant for this to happen in his place. She looked at him, and he stopped talking. The waitress brought the bill, hands shaking. It was already paid, she said, by someone. Mei Fang glanced at her daughters, then turned back to Hernandez. She was ready to go home. The officers were let out in handcuffs. No one laughed. Oh. No one jeered. The walk of shame was quiet. As Mei Fang exited the diner with her children, heads turned, but no one dared say anything. Not because of fear, but because they had nothing left to say. The narrative had flipped, not by volume or violence, but by calm, unmovable force. The sun outside was warmer now, the breeze lighter. As they crossed the parking lot, a man in a business suit held the door open for them. His nod was genuine. Behind them, phones were still recording, but now the focus had changed. No longer a spectacle of abuse, but a story of reasserted dignity. The image of Mei Fang standing with a badge in one hand and her daughters in the other would travel far beyond Langston. But for now, her only destination was home, and the quiet there would be earned, not expected. Inside the diner, as the doors swung shut, someone whispered a phrase that would soon be echoed in headlines across the country. They messed with the wrong woman, but Mei Fang hadn't come to fight. She'd come to eat breakfast, and yet, when the fight came to her, she answered, not with anger, but with law. And the world had no choice but to listen. The house smelled of laundry, detergent, and ginger tea. Outside, the last blush of sun faded over the rooftops, turning the windows of the neighborhood into orange squares, flickering against the darkening blue. It had been a long day, one of those days that wrapped itself around your bones, not just your thoughts. And in the quiet of her modest living room, Lin Meifang moved like someone trying not to wake a sleeping memory. She was barefoot now, her sweater exchanged for a cotton blouse, her hair undone and pinned loosely. Her daughters had been tucked into bed 30 minutes ago, both of them exhausted, both of them clinging to her until sleep won out. She had sat with them as long as they needed, stroking Xiaoting's hair, adjusting Xiaoyu's blankets. They had spoken little. Xiaoting had asked with a voice just above a whisper if her hoodie would be okay. Meifang promised to clean it, to fix it. She didn't say that some things wouldn't wash out. She didn't have to. She kissed both girls on the forehead and stood slowly, as if pulling herself from warm water back into the world's chill. In the laundry room, she gently placed the pink hoodie in a plastic basin and filled it with cold water. The coffee stain had already dried, the fibers stiff and dark. She added detergent, moving her hands carefully through the fabric, scrubbing not just for cleanliness, but as if absolving it of injustice. The stain began to fade, but the day would not. Her office was down the hall, small, functional, and meticulously kept. The desk was walnut, worn at the corners. One wall was lined with folders, most thick, some marked with red tags. A framed photograph sat to the left of her monitor, her academy graduation, Quantico, 8 years ago. She stood front and center, expression proud but unreadable. Beside her, a few classmates she barely remembered now. In the lower corner, handwritten in black ink, were the words, "Quiet strength wins wars." Dad. She sat slowly, rubbing her temples before opening her laptop. Notifications, blinked emails, messages, social media alerts. The story had gone viral. She had known it would. The footage from the diner had already been clipped and shared across several platforms. Headlines varied in tone, but one phrase repeated again and again. FBI agent silently shuts down racist cops. She closed the tab. She wasn't interested in the public version. The real version, the one she had lived, didn't require edits or filters. It didn't need commentary. It lived in her daughter's startled scream, in the heat that lingered on Xiaoting's back, in the way the waitress's hands trembled when she delivered the check. It lived in the silence before the badge. Her phone buzzed softly against the desk. The caller ID read, Miguel Hernandez. She answered on the second ring. His voice was quieter than before, less measured and more human. He told her what she already suspected. The internal review had moved quickly, too quickly for comfort. Maddox and Malloy had been the subject of 14 previous complaints, all filed within the past 5 years. Some involved the use of force, others verbal misconduct. 2 had been classified as excessive behavior toward minors. All had been closed without discipline. 2 resulted in civil settlements, paid quietly by the city. It was not new to Meifang. She'd worked enough oversight cases to know the pattern: report, silence, pay, erase. Until someone filmed, until someone credible enough forced the system to see itself. Miguel said they had reopened the files, A federal investigation was on the table. And then, almost hesitantly, he added that the Bureau wanted her to lead a new task force, one focused on civil rights accountability across regional law enforcement. The department was under scrutiny, and leadership wanted to make a visible shift. She had credibility, she had moral clarity, and now she had the country's attention. Mei Fang didn't respond right away. Her eyes moved to the wall of files. Names, numbers, dates, entire lives reduced to paperwork and footnotes. She thought of the woman in Mississippi who had sent her the handwritten letter 2 years ago, thanking her for showing up at her son's wrongful arrest hearing. Of the migrant father who hugged her in silence after she brought charges against a corrupt border agent. Of the teenage girl in Arkansas who had been called suspicious for sitting in her own car outside her high school. She remembered them all. She told Miguel yes, not out of ambition, but because someone had to. And because the next mother might not be there to pull the badge. The following morning, the world was still spinning too fast. News outlets camped outside the local police station. Op-eds bloomed overnight. Hashtags trended. And yet, inside Mei Fang's home, things moved slowly. Breakfast was made. Lunches were packed. Xiao Yu asked for 2 braids instead of 1. Xiao Ting wanted to wear the butterfly dress again. The town, however, could not return to business as usual. The mayor, pressed by community leaders and state officials, called for an emergency forum. The location chosen was symbolic. Dixie Jack's. The same diner. The place where everything had happened. The sign outside had been changed by the owner himself. In black block letters it read, "We speak up." That evening the booths were pushed aside. The room had been cleared of tables, replaced with folding chairs. The usual warmth of syrup and grease was replaced by a strange buzz. Uncertainty, guilt, guarded hope. Local officials sat on one side, residents on the other. In the center stood a portable screen. Projected on it was a still image from the video. Maddox mid-motion, arm extended. Coffee flying, shouting flinching. Mei Fang still seated, her hand rising. The freeze frame was powerful because it captured what words could not. The impact of silence. The moment before correction, the injustice held aloft like a fist. She stood before the crowd, not in uniform. She wore the same soft sweater as that morning. No badge, no weapon, no podium. Just presence. Her daughters were not with her. They were home, coloring, laughing, healing. Mei Fang looked at the image, then at the faces watching her. Some ashamed, some hardened, some leaning forward, hoping for permission to change. She said very little. Only what mattered. You don't need a badge to do what's right. You just need a backbone. And maybe next time, one of you will stand before I have to. Then she stepped aside. No applause followed. Only standing. Every person rose. Not in unison. Not like a performance. But gradually like breath returning after fear. Back at home, Mei Fang entered the kitchen to find Xiao Ting hunched over the table, with markers spread everywhere. She was drawing a big purple FBI badge, but in the center of it she had placed a teddy bear. Xiao Yu sat beside her, helping her color in the letters. Xiao Yu looked up and asked why their mother hadn't yelled. Mei Fang knelt beside them, brushing their hair from their eyes. She said nothing for a while. Then she told them people who harm others often destroy themselves if you let them speak long enough. Xiao Yu asked if she was going to catch more bad people. Mei Fang smiled softly. Only the loud ones, she said. The quiet ones. You two will catch them. You'll grow up and fight with truth. And in their faces, she saw the future. Not cleaner, not easier, but better. The podium was plain, the seal behind it austere. No flags, no ceremonial flourishes. Just a long table with microphones, several rows of folding chairs, and a blank gray backdrop behind a narrow wooden stage. Cameras were clustered at the edges of the press room, like insects drawn to a sudden light. Lenses blinking, reporters murmuring as they prepared their questions. It wasn't a usual press briefing. It wasn't even planned until 48 hours earlier. But the story had outgrown local headlines. It had stirred something that couldn't be pushed back underground, not this time. Lin Mei Fang stood off stage, arms at her sides, head bowed for a moment, not in deference but in quiet preparation. She wore a dark blue blouse, minimal jewelry, and no makeup. Her hair was pinned back simply, a few wisps falling around her face. She didn't glance at the cameras, didn't adjust her posture to look more composed. She just breathed. Around her, senior bureau officials filled their seats. Some had flown in from Washington. Most had never met her in person. But all had seen the footage. All had read the brief. And none had argued when her name was the one submitted to lead the newly formed Civil Rights Accountability Task Force. The moment arrived. A staffer tapped a microphone. Feedback rang briefly, then faded. The room went still. Miguel Hernandez, now acting as bureau spokesperson for the division, stepped to the microphone and cleared his throat. He began with formalities, noting the purpose of the event, to introduce a new federal initiative dedicated to monitoring, reviewing, and investigating violations of civil rights within law enforcement agencies across the country. He listed a few recent cases, one still under review. He mentioned the diner incident without elaboration. The details, he said, were already in the public eye. Then he turned slightly and gestured for Meifang to approach. The cameras clicked louder. A few reporters leaned forward in their seats. She stepped up, adjusted the microphone just slightly, and looked out over the room. Her eyes didn't search for faces. They held still, clear, and unsparing. One reporter, a woman near the front, raised her hand without being called on. Her voice carried quickly. "What made you accept the role?" Meifang didn't look at her directly. She didn't need to. She said the words softly, each one firm. "They threw hot coffee at my child, so I threw back the law." Then she stepped down. The silence afterward was almost reverent. Reporters scribbled furiously. The cameras kept rolling, but no one else asked another question. Hernandez returned to the mic only to conclude the briefing and thank everyone for attending. The room slowly emptied. Outside, the sun was high and hard. Inside, the words she had left behind echoed longer than applause ever could. Back in Langston, the diner had changed. The booths were rearranged, some replaced altogether. The counter had been refinished, and the owner, whose hands still trembled slightly when speaking, had posted a new sign in the window. It was small, white letters on clear glass. "We speak up." Beneath it, in finer print, another phrase had been etched quietly into the corner. "Silence is never neutral." A particular booth, the one near the window where it had all happened, now bore a plaque. The wood was polished, the letters engraved with care. Reserved for the one who stayed silent until it mattered. Underneath, in smaller text, Special Agent Lin Meifang and daughters always watching. The owner had installed it himself. He hadn't asked permission. He didn't feel he needed to. He'd been one of the silent ones. Now he understood why that was never enough. Days passed, then weeks. The outrage began to soften in the news cycle, but not in the town. Community groups met more often. A new board was formed to review complaints against local officers. Training modules were updated. The mayor issued a formal apology. Some said it was too late. Others said it was a start. Meifang stayed out of it. She didn't seek credit, didn't attend every event. Her work had shifted. She was now reviewing reports from across the Southeast, some from towns just like Langston, others from cities that claimed to be progressive until evidence showed otherwise. She read testimony from mothers whose sons had been pulled over again and again for no reason, from teenagers who had been pepper sprayed during peaceful protests, from officers of color within departments who'd been isolated for speaking up. Each file carried its own weight, but the heaviest was still the one that hadn't been written down. The one that unfolded, not on paper, but in the frightened eyes of her daughter. The memory of Xiao Ting shrinking under the shout of a man in uniform. That was the file that lived in her bones. And it was the one that drove her now. One evening, about 6 weeks after the press conference, Meifang sat on the floor of the living room sorting paperwork while her daughters colored at the kitchen table. The TV was off. The windows were open, letting in the last breath of spring. Shouting held up a drawing. It was a new version of the FBI badge drawn in purple marker, with a teddy bear in the middle. She had even added tiny stars around it. Xiao Yu was working on her own version, a little more detailed, the eagle's wings shaded carefully. Meifang smiled at them. Xiao Yu asked if she'd had to yell at the officers. Meifang said no. Xiao Yu asked why not. Meifang paused. "Because I wanted them to hear themselves," she said. "People like that, they destroy themselves if you let them speak long enough." Xiaoting thought about that for a while, then asked if her mother was going to catch more bad people. Only the loud ones, Meifeng replied. The quiet ones, you too will catch them. You'll grow up and you'll fight with truth. Xiaoyu nodded slowly. Can I be FBI too? Meifeng pulled them close. You can be anything, she said. Just never let them silence your worth. That night, after they went to bed, she returned to her desk and opened her laptop. A new case had arrived, an internal tip about a sheriff's department outside Atlanta. A troubling pattern, familiar language. She opened the file, began to read, but before she began to type her notes, she paused, opened a drawer, and pulled out the badge. Not to admire it, just to remember what it meant. Not power, not protection, responsibility. A week later, another conference, another crowd. But this time, it wasn't press, it was community. Langston's local high school gymnasium, hundreds of folding chairs, filled by people who, weeks earlier, had either watched in silence or hadn't been there at all. The town was listening now. Meifeng stood on stage in the same soft gray sweater. No notes, no staff, no titles. Just her. She didn't talk about what happened in the diner. She didn't mention the officers' names. She didn't retell the story. She let the town keep that. They needed to carry it themselves now. What she gave them was a choice. You don't need a badge to do what's right, she told them. You just need a backbone. And maybe next time, one of you will stand before I have to. There was no applause. Only people standing. And that was louder than anything. Outside, as she helped her daughters into the car, Xiaoting whispered that she wanted to be brave like her mom. You already are, Meifeng said. Then she looked out across the parking lot where people lingered, talking quietly, some crying, some hugging. It wasn't healing yet, but it had begun. And sometimes change doesn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives like a woman standing in silence until it matters. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay tuned for the next powerful story.